Hi, it's Justin with Spalted Stack Studio, and in this video we're going to make a keepsake box. For this build, I'm going to start with the lid. Now normally, I kind of make the base first, but since this will be the main focal point, I want to start with this and I'll build off of that. And I'll start that process by ripping down walnut, curly maple, and padauk. Once I get everything ripped down, I'll take it to the planer and get everything to the same thickness. Normally it doesn't take that much of an effort to do this, but the curly maple is significantly thinner than the rest of my material, so I did have to spend a fair amount of time planing. Next I'll rip everything down to its final width. Now, I didn't do this to begin with because some of these pieces are going to be fairly thin and I don't want it to rock on the planer. I am ripping these down slightly oversized, and that's just because some of them are really thin and I don't want to rip that thin on the table saw. It doesn't really give you that accurate of a cut and it's kind of a risky process. So it's much better to rip oversized, take it to your planer, and get your final thicknesses that way. Unfortunately my pieces weren't quite long enough to do one single glue up, so I had to do two separate glue ups. To save a little time, I ended up gluing them together. I realized thankfully last minute that that was a really bad idea and the squeeze out could actually glue them permanently together. So I just took a piece of boxing tape, put it in between, and that prevented them from sticking to each other. I'll start by clamping my claws to the project. And claws are just used to make sure that everything stays nice and flat during the clamping process. Glue acts like a lubricant and makes the wood very slippery. So if you're not careful as you're clamping, it will slide around and it could potentially ruin your project. And you only want these just to be snug. After you apply your other clamps, you can slowly start tightening everything up until it's actually tight. If you tighten it too much off the bat, it may bind it and you might not get a nice clean glue up. I ended up just making a quick jig on the table saw to cut the miters. I do have a miter saw, but I was really having trouble getting it to cut accurately. And some of these pieces are a little small to be using on it since I don't have an actual table set up for it yet. It did take a couple test cuts to get this to cut perfectly, but after that everything went nice and smooth. Next up, I'll cut the rabbets for the centerpiece of the lid. Now this would have been much better to do before I cut the miters. I just honestly kind of forgot about it, so I had to make do with what I had. Off camera I cut the centerpiece, which is curly maple, and that'll fit nice and snug in the rabbets we just cut. And we really don't have to worry about wood movement. Generally if you're under 4 inches, the amount it's going to move is going to be very minuscule, so I'm okay. I don't need to do a floating panel on this, but any larger and it would have had to been a floating panel in order to compensate for the wood movement. Now that we got the top done, we can start working on the base. I really don't got to worry about an infinity edge or whatever. I'll be doing inlays, so that'll give you a break in between each piece of wood, so it won't really stand out if there's any difference in the grain. Next up, I'll cut the dados for the base, and since this is only going to be a 1/4 inch base, I really don't need to mess with the dado blade or anything. It's just 2 passes. Since I'm installing a drawer on this box, I'm going to run another set of dados. That set of dados is going to be the base of the hinged part of the box. The one that we just ran will be the actual base of the box. I did a quick and dirty template on the laser, and then I'll use a 1/4 inch upcut bit to cut out excess material. Now I'm not riding on the edge, I'm getting as close as I can without hitting it, but I want to remove most of this material before I go in with a flush trim bit and clean everything up. And unfortunately my laser can only really cut through an 1/8 inch thick material, so I have to be really careful when I'm using a flush trim bit on this. There's not enough meat for the bearing to ride securely on, and it's very easy to push too hard, damage the template, or just to have the router get away from me. And unfortunately that happened in this project. I hit a soft spot on the wood, which caused it to take out a nice chunk of the top part of the cutout. So I just moved the template up a little bit and removed some more material. But that changed the size of the hole and I wasn't able to use the template to square everything up. So I went in with a ruler and a marking knife, made some nice marks, and then cleaned everything up with the chisel. So now I can cut the bevels for the sides. Now since I'm using a different blade right here, I moved over my fence a little bit just so I have a clean cut and I can make sure that everything gets cut right up to the edge. As always, I'll use some blue tape and do a mock clamping session just to make sure everything fits together nicely. Now I've always been a little leery on this tape method, but the more I use it, the more I'm starting to respect it. It works really well and I've never actually had it fail on me. I still like using strap clamps, but you probably really don't need it. Before I actually glue anything together, I'm going to apply a little blue tape on the inside seam. And that's just going to assist me in the squeeze out cleanup. Off camera, I already cut out the bases. Now I am using the base as a flush stop for the drawer face, so I won't be able to center it on the sides. So I glued it to the front of the base, but I made sure to leave plenty on the back side of the box for wood movement. Other than that, everything went together just fine. And again, you probably really don't need these strap clamps. So if you don't have them, the blue tape's just fine. You don't need to go buy these. But I have them, so I'm going to use them just in case something fails. I went through my leftover curly maple and tried to find a piece that best fit in the hole we cut out earlier. I really wanted it to look like the grain continued through and that this piece was the piece that was cut out of the hole. I didn't do anything too complex for the drawers, just a quick lap joint. These are a little too small to use the dovetail jig and I am terrible at doing it by hand. It's something I really need to practice on. Off camera, I went ahead and cut the base to size and then ran the dados on the sides. Now if you notice, I'm only applying glue in the center of the end grain side of the base, and that's just to allow for wood movement. This isn't that much over 4 inches, so wood movement's minimal, but it's still something you should compensate for in this drawer. Squareness is also going to be a very important factor. This drawer will be sliding in and out of a pretty tight fitting hole, so if it's out of square, you're going to get a lot of binding. I kind of came up with this method on the fly. I wasn't sure how well it would work, but it did seem to work out just fine. All I'm doing is applying equal amounts of blue tape on each side, then putting it into the hole and seeing if I get a tight fit. Once I have a tight fit, I'll move on to the other sides. Basically, I'm just using the tape as a shim to center the face in the hole. If I get everything centered, I'll apply some wood glue and a teeny bit of CA glue in the center just to hold the face in place. Once I get that on, I'll pull it back out and I'll apply some clamps. And I did make a little bit of a mistake here. I should have had some boards on the outside of this to clamp on. When I clamped it in the center right here, it actually caused the boards to cup and it created some problems later on in the build. Next up, I'll cut the rabbets for the Paduk inlays. Now it's really important that this is perfectly square, that way you have a equal reveal on all 4 sides. So prior to me actually cutting on the box, I did a bunch of test cuts and measurements on some scrap wood. I also have to be really careful about how much material I remove. If I end up removing too much, the box is just going to fall apart. Even removing what I did, I still have to be careful about how I hold the box or where I apply pressure until I get the inlays glued in. I cut these inlays a little oversized, and then I'll come in and clean it up with the flush trim bit. I'm also being sure to keep them all facing the same direction, because with this Padauk it's really easy to get confused on which side is the face grain and which side is the edge grain. The glue up's a pretty straightforward process. I'm just making sure that the face grain is facing the same direction on all the pieces and that the bottoms are going to be flush with the box. And since I'm actually gluing these to the end grain of the box, I'm going to pre-saturate the wood with the wood glue and let it sit and dry for about 5 minutes. Once you do that, you'll see it draw in all that glue, and it'll help clog the pores and give you a better glue up. And here I'll use my strap clamps again, but you could use any kind of clamp. You just need quite a few of them to obtain the same pressure that this is going to offer me. Now that the glue's all dry, I go ahead and take it to the router table and use my flush trim bit and get everything nice and smooth. Now that I've got that done, we can do the top. And now I've done this before in a different video, however, I'm changing it up a little bit and using some stop blocks on the inside of the box. And that's just because I want a nice flush glue up on that part. That way I don't have to get inside with the flush trim bit and clean up the inside of the box. So I'll tape down my first cut, make sure it's nice and snug so it doesn't move. Then I'll take another piece, put it up to my miter, and use a marking knife to mark the inside angle of my cut. Once I'm done with that, I'll make a nice thick line with my square, then I'll take it over the table saw and use that as my line to cut on. And once you're here, it's imperative that you're incredibly accurate. If you're even a hair off, that's going to be a gap. So take your time, line everything up, and take small bites so you have small mistakes. And we'll just repeat that process on all 4 sides, and then we're ready for the glue up. Again, this is a situation where the blue tape comes in handy. There is some clamps I've seen before that use a rubber band to hold things down like this, but unfortunately I don't have these, so I have to resort to tape. And once everything's glued, we go back to the flush trim bit and square everything up. This thing's a monster. This is my most used bit, and I never get burns. It's sharp as the first time I used it. It's an amazing bit. So this part of the hinge installation is going to be relatively similar to my other box. I'm just using some double-sided tape to hold it in place, and then I'll go in with my marking knife and trace it out. And thankfully I got my new double-sided tape. The stuff I was using before wasn't very good. It would shift as you applied pressure with the marking knife, so it just kind of defeated the whole purpose of being, I don't know, tape. Once I get everything traced with the marking knife, I'll use that mark and outline it with my chisel. I'm not going very deep. I don't want to risk splitting the wood. I'm just making a cut so I can get in there with the router plane and my chisel and get it nice and flat. And generally I use the chisel to remove most of the material. Once I get it close, I'll bring in the hand plane, use that to flatten everything, and then just take off a little bit at a time so that way it fits the hinge perfectly. And this is one of the situations where you want to take tiny bites. I'm only turning the knob to lower the blade, maybe 1/8 of a turn. Then I'll test the hinge and repeat the process. Now I do want the hinge to sit a little bit lower than the sides, just because I haven't sanded the sides yet. And with my router plane, I have a stop lock onto it, so once I find the appropriate depth, I can lock that in, raise the blade, then slowly walk it down on the next hinge. So now that we got the lower hinges routed out, we can transfer that to the lid. Now since this lid overhangs the box, it's going to be a little more complicated than normal, but it's not too bad. So I'm going to start by using some double-sided tape, taping the lid to the box, and just making sure everything's nice and centered. And of course I got to work around the dog because he has to be laying at my feet. So I'll use a marking knife to kind of outline the holes that we just routed out for the lower part of the hinge. Now the sides of it, you're not going to be able to make a full mark, but once we remove the base, we'll use a square and use that to finish our lines. So I'll place my marking knife in the hole that I just made, and then I'll walk the square up to that. That way I'm sure that it's a perfect line and it's in the exact location that I need it to be in. So this part is where it got a little complicated. So since the hinge won't be able to extend past the box, I have to line up the plate with the line we made, and then I'm going to use a marking knife and trace the whole hinge. And it's going to be really important that you're accurate on this. If you're off a little bit, your lid's going to sit on crooked or it's going to have a big gap. And since this hole is going to be so small, we're not going to be able to use the router plane. This is all going to have to be done with a chisel. So it's really important that you take your time and make sure that everything's nice and flat. If you're taking too much off of one side and not the other, the hinge is going to sit crooked and it's not going to close well. So take your time, take tiny bites, and constantly use your hinge as a reference. It's really important that you don't take too much material off. Now that we got everything flush, we have to remove a little more material on the back end. And this is going to allow the hinge to rotate properly. We're not taking off very much, maybe a 1/16 of an inch deep and a hair farther back. We already have the holes marked, so we know where our hinge is going to sit. Now we just need to make sure that it can move. Now that we got everything carved out, I'll use my center punch, mark everything, drill some pilot holes, and screw everything together. Now I'm going to be taking this apart later to put the finish on, but I want to test everything and make sure it fits good. And these screws strip really easy, and they don't really give you any extra screws, which is kind of surprising considering these are on the higher side of $40. So I like to pre-drill 1/16 inch hole, and then I just put a little bit of wax on the end of the screw, and that helps it go in fairly easily. For the handle for the drawer, I was kind of back and forth on a couple different styles. I really wanted to keep everything that I could wood, so I ended up just choosing to do something simple, and thankfully it came out looking really good. I just pretty much freestyled this, just using my plane to get everything close as I can to what I want, and then I used some sandpaper and got it to the final shape. And to finish up, I'm hitting it with some 240 grit, just making sure everything's nice and smooth, and then I'll take it down to the spray room. Overall, I was really happy with this box. The Padauk was a little more intense than I wanted. Normally I use it with walnut and it's a nice subtle contrast to it. Against the maple, it really stood out. But it looks good, and we also custom engraved their baby's information on the lid, so it's a nice personal box for a newborn. Anyways, thanks for watching, like and subscribe.